Polls are showing Joe Biden with a strong lead over Donald Trump in the U.S. presidential election. But wasn't this also the case in 2016, when polls showed Hillary Clinton way ahead of Trump? Many gave Clinton incredibly high odds of winning, and we all know what happened. Sam Wong of the Princeton Election Consortium gave Trump a 1% chance of winning in 2016, and then said he'd eat a bug if Trump got more than 240 electoral votes. He ended up eating his words, or crickets.
Here it goes.
So given all this, how reliable are today's polls? The American Association of Public Opinion Research convened a committee after 2016 to figure out what went wrong, and there's a lot we can learn from its findings. Polls, by definition, take small samples of the population to guess at what voters will ultimately decide. It's not an exact science. Pollsters know that there are inherent biases when it comes to their surveys. Since polls are voluntary, you're naturally going to miss all the people who say thanks, but I'll pass. This is known as non-response bias. Polls also rely on the honesty of the respondent, and this might surprise you, but some people will say they vote and then don't. Surveys often use previous elections as a template, so they'll miss people who haven't voted but end up going to the polls. That's one factor that led to Trump's win in 2016. The polls 4 years ago also didn't account for last-minute ballot booth decisions from undecided voters, another factor that led to Trump's win. To help even out areas of potential bias, pollsters will add or subtract additional weight to their results to compensate for groups that are underrepresented and overly represented in their surveys. They do this by adjusting the responses based on the demographics of the group they're surveying. This is known as weighting. In 2016, lots of polls added weight to underrepresented groups, such as minorities and younger voters, based on the census totals for that region. But one thing many state polls, particularly in key swing states, didn't account for in 2016 was education level. A typical poll has about 45% of respondents having a bachelor's degree or higher, but the census shows that only 28% of adults have a bachelor's. And those numbers also vary a lot from state to state. In 2016, several state polls had an overrepresentation of college-educated respondents that tended to favor Clinton, especially in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And those states all went to Trump. What's more, people with less formal education are also less likely to take part in surveys. There's that non-response bias again. On the other hand, national polls, for the most part, did take education into account in 2016. In fact, the Public Opinion Research Association says 2016 national polls were the most accurate in estimating the popular vote since 1936. Clinton won the popular vote by 2 percentage points, and the average national poll had her winning by just 3 percentage points. But state polls were off by 5 percentage points, the largest error in election polling since 2000. Because U.S. presidents aren't elected by a popular vote, the state polls were critical in underestimating Trump's strength in large electoral college states. Another area of confusion in 2016 was understanding the difference between a poll and a forecast. Forecasters take aggregate data from polls and run their own analysis to predict winners, often written in the form of a probability percentage, such as Clinton having a 70% or a 99% chance of winning in 2016. Both seem pretty high, but there's a huge difference between the two. When it comes to elections, lots of people have a hard time wrapping their heads around probability. Some confuse it with vote share percentages, such as the traditional election poll showing who's winning by a certain percentage. Studies have shown that increased use of probability in election coverage has the effect of making candidates who are leading seem stronger than they actually are. These probabilistic forecasts tend to increase people's sense of certainty of an outcome, and they can decrease voter turnout. Many pollsters are trying to find different ways to explain probability now. The popular election site 538 now gives their predictions in the form of 100 possible outcomes. Their model simulates the election 40,000 times and then takes a random sample of 100 of those and tells you, of those, how many Trump won and how many Biden won. As of October 30th, Trump won 11 times out of 100, while Biden won 89 times out of 100. That seems a lot more digestible than saying Biden has an 89% chance of winning. And here's what else pollsters are doing differently in 2020. Many state polls are now weighting by education. Some are even weighting by education within even more specific groups. Pollsters are also taking into account the geographic region of respondents and whether they live in cities, suburbs, or rural areas. More polls are also looking at electoral college predictions instead of just the popular vote. Many are also recruiting people by mail and using voter registration lists instead of random dialing to find respondents. But even with all this, pollsters are still worried about 2020 unpredictability due to the COVID-19 pandemic. More than 84% of voters can vote by mail right now, and many states are offering extended early voting. Pollsters are anticipating many more disruptions to the typical election year. There is the chance of rejected ballots, long lines that cause people to go home, vote counting mistakes, and last-minute changes to voting patterns due to the pandemic. One thing we do know, though, is that of the more than 120 million votes cast in the 2016 election, only 107,000 voters decided the contest in just 3 states. So read about the latest polling with a critical eye, and then go vote.